Welcome back to the Cream City Club podcast. I am Spencer Michaelis, and I'm here again with Gunnar Amelunk. Gunnar, how you doing? We're doing a little bit of a different Saturday afternoon recording here.
Yeah, a slight emergency podcast, but I'm excited and not to talk about the podcast before the podcast, but we've been waiting for this day for a while, so we've got a lot of thoughts and ready to get started. So how you doing, Spencer?
I'm doing well, doing well. Long week of baseball, and the Brewers decided to make it a longer week of baseball. But like you said, we're excited about this one, so I'm ready to get into it. But first, if you are listening and you haven't yet subscribed, please take a moment to do so on whatever platform you're on. And if you believe that we've earned it, to rate us 5 stars, that would be great. Follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod to stay up to date on these episode releases. And just another reminder that right now we are still running the 100 follower giveaway. It's the pin tweet on our account. So check that out. Give us a follow, a retweet, and you will be entered. And then we'll run that as soon as we get to 100 followers. But like Gunnar kind of alluded to here, today's episode, we're going to be focused on the Brewers and really just on the trade that just happened this week.
Yep, and then I guess Spencer alluded to it already, but yeah, we're here to talk about the Corbin Burns trade, and we're going to break it all down for you guys. And then, yeah, I think we can just kind of jump right into it here. The full trade details we've got sort of laid out here. Obviously, the Brewers give up our dear old friend Corbin Burns, and the Brewers receive infielder Joey Ortiz, left-handed pitcher DL Hall, and the 34th pick in the next upcoming draft. So, obviously, I think first we want to start out with here is breaking down sort of what we got in each individual player. I know Spencer's probably very eager to break each of these guys down. I'll do my best to throw in my tidbits, but this is going to be Spencer, and I know everyone's waiting for Spencer's opinion on these guys. So, starting out, let's start with left-handed pitcher DL Hall. Spencer, break it all down. Give us everything you got on the left-handed pitcher.
Yeah. So I'll start it off by saying if you really want a lot of in-depth information, I did write an article for Brewer Fanatic about DL Hall with a lot of information in there. So check that out if you have a chance. But to give it in a little bit of a shorter breakdown here. So basically what it comes down to is DL Hall has some of the best stuff in all of baseball for a pitching prospect. I mean, it is Baseball America gave him an 80 grade fastball. And when you look at it, you can see why. So any lefty who's throwing 95, 97, touching 98, 99 at times, that's going to be pretty noteworthy on its own. The big thing with Hall is that it goes beyond just the velocity, though. And the reason it's an 80 grade pitch is because it goes well beyond the velocity. So he gets 7 feet of extension, which means he's adding about 2 miles per hour in terms of like perceived velocity for the hitter. So if he is throwing upper 90s, it's looking more like triple digits to a hitter. Second of all, he has a very flat vertical approach angle, which I've talked about a little bit on other episodes. But the main thing to keep in mind with the flat vertical approach angle is that it basically plays the trick of when hitters say a fastball is rising, it's obviously not actually rising. It's just sinking less than what gravity would normally put on the ball. And that flat vertical approach angle means it's coming in at a flatter angle than what hitters are used to. So it plays a trick on the eyes. It plays well up above and at the top of the zone. Um, the main thing he's probably going to be working on with the fastball when he gets here is that with the Orioles against righties, he wasn't getting it up very often. So it makes it a little bit more hittable if it's down in the zone. Brewer fans have kind of seen it with Freddie Peralta over the years. It's a very similar fastball to Freddie, except I would say he's got much more consistent mid to upper 90s velo in the tank than what Freddie has. Um, but yeah, we're talking about possibly one of the best fastballs in baseball when he makes it, or assuming he's either out of the pen or starting, we're talking one of the best fastballs in baseball. But the big thing with Hall is that he also has three secondaries that are probably considered borderline plus or better on all three of them. So his slider, by most accounts, is the best of the three. He 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 struggled a bit with it in MLB out of the bullpen. I think it was mostly just a little bit of a command issue for him. It got hit a little bit harder than you would expect, but he can absolutely make Baseball America gave it a 70 grade, which is plus plus. He made a change in the middle of June last year where instead of it being more of like a sweeping slider, he added 9 inches of vertical break without losing any of his sweep on the slider, which is kind of unheard of for a change that's made on the fly. Like it's very hard to make that type of change in season, and he did it pretty easily. And turn to that shape, like it's a really good pitch that should be very successful for him in the majors. I think he probably has to get a little bit better about just getting it out of the zone. It seemed like he left it up in the zone quite a bit, maybe getting it down more, getting it out of the zone. Um, but once he finds that, it should be a put away, wipeout pitch for him. He also throws a curveball that got a 60 grade from Baseball America, so that would also classify as being a plus pitch. Is actually a pitch he had gotten rid of. It was known as his best secondary when he got drafted by the Orioles. He got rid of it when he got the Pro Bowl in favor of the slider, and then in 2022 he brought it back, and it seems to be a good call to have done that because it's a completely different pitch from the slider, in velocity and movement. So it's definitely a separated pitch where he can use all three of those, and it's not going to run together. Some people sliders and curveballs will kind of run together, form one pitch that doesn't really trick a hitter any differently when they throw the slider versus the curveball, but his should be completely separate. Um, Stuff plus, which is Saris, he has an ability to kind of measure 100 being league average for stuff plus metric. He comes in at 106 for the curveball. It's at 123 for the or 132 for the slider on the new one that he started throwing. So well above average on the slider and above average on the curveball. And then he also throws a changeup that also got a 60 grade from Baseball America. So the changeup is his best secondary for right-handed hitters. As a lefty, that's not shocking. That's normally how it works. It's he only really throws it against righties. He's thrown 111 changeups in the majors, and 110 have been against righties. So don't expect to see it lefty-lefty, but I will say the numbers on it so far in MLB have not looked very good. Hitters hit 294 with a 550 slug against it. But if you look at the expected stats on Baseball Savant, it was an expected batting average of 189, so over 100 points lower, and an expected slugging of 368, which is almost 200 points lower than what he had. So I think he had really, really bad luck on the changeup in MLB, and I hope that the Brewers, I assume they are going to allow him to continue using it quite a bit against righties because I think it's going to be a good pitch. I'm talking a lot here, but just one more thing. The command is probably what we need to be concerned about and what we're going to need to see improve if he's going to start. He I'll just give the Baseball America grade on it is 30, which is not good. 20 to 80 scale, that's you're talking 45, 50s around average, 30s bad. He walked people at 14% at a 14% rate in AAA. When he came up to the majors and was pitching out of the pen, it was 6.2%, which is that's really good. That's better than most pitchers. Um, Interestingly, Saris also has location plus, and it backs up kind of the MLB results. He wasn't getting lucky that he wasn't walking guys. He was an above average pitcher in terms of location in the majors at 106. So if he can carry even close to that, even close to average command to the starting rotation, I think the Brewers got a starter here, and I think they probably got a good one. If he can't, I think there's a pretty good chance they got another Josh Hader type pitcher, and I'm talking like possibly early career Josh Hader, where he's working multiple innings, where he is just a huge strikeout type pitcher. He was over 30% strikeout rate in the majors this year, which would have been only six starters were able to carry that for a whole season this year. So this is I know that like prospect ranking wise, he technically has graduated in most settings now. He was more like back half, bottom part of the top 100 when he was eligible. If the command can be what it was in the majors as a starter, he would have been, if he was showing this level of command in the minors that he showed in the majors, he would have been probably a top 50, top 30 level prospect if he was showing this type of command while he was in like AAA. So there's risk, and you could see him being a pen guy, but I've after looking into him more and more, I really do feel pretty good about saying I think he's going to start, and he could be good. He could be really, really good.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, Hall's, like you said, a name that we're obviously always trying to make trades and stuff, and we talked about the Orioles. I think we just mentioned it towards the end of kind of our Corbin Burns talks, actually, too. We're like, oh, wait, that's actually a perfect place to go. Um, so I've been trying to think of trades and stuff probably for a while, and even over the years, I think I've seen his name pop up here and there, but that was gonna be my question for you. Obviously, you said he's got the stuff if he can control it to be a starter. Do you think there's And he was a starter in AAA. I know that too, even last year. But do you think there's sort of a hurdle, like, I don't know if it's mentally endurance. Do you think it comes down to like any of that stuff? Because we saw like Burns and Freddie be like bullpen guys, quote unquote, when we first called them up. Then you got to switch over to being a starter in the major leagues. Is there like a hurdle you have to jump there maybe to be a starter, or does it just come down to like stuff? Do you think like if he can just control his stuff, he'll be fine and you don't have to worry about it? Because the last 2 years in the big leagues, he's had a lot of appearances in the bullpen, which he's been successful at.
Right. So it is funny you say that because this plan of approach kind of fits with what the Brewers normally do with their starting pitching prospects, right? Like we saw it with Burns, we saw it with Freddie, we even saw it with Woodruff. I mean, he was a reliever for a good chunk of his first year.
Hmm.
We saw it with Ashby, who came up as a reliever right away, other than like his first start. Same with Freddie and Woody. Like those guys' first appearances were starts, and then they were mostly relievers for a year. This kind of fits the Brewers' MO of a guy who started in AAA and then he went to the pen when he came up to the majors, and then they transition him back into starting. I think in terms of a hurdle, there is. I mean, in terms of going deep into games, you probably are going to have to somewhat build him back up. Um, but also in this day and age, it's really not that common for guys to go that deep into games anyway. So I think there's probably going to be an adjustment period if he does go back to starting, which I think, unless he is against it, which Matt Arnold said they're going to talk to him and kind of figure out what they think works best together. If they go with, if as long as he's open to starting and he wants to start, I think they're going to give him a very good chance of making the Brewers rotation out of spring. And at that point, I would expect him to be a 5 to 6 inning starter on like his best days. You're probably not looking at a guy who's going 7, even if he's pitching really well. But I don't think there's a huge actual hurdle. I think he's probably somebody who he's been, like you said, he started in AAA. He only came up to the pen like the last 2 months of the season. I would assume he went into the offseason still trying to prepare as a starter, knowing that he might end up being a reliever. But most of those guys aren't going to stop preparing like a starter until they are told that they should absolutely prepare to be a reliever. And that even looking back at Hader, there were a couple years after he came up where everyone was like, oh, he's still kind of thinking about being a starter. Um, I think he'd be fine to get back into starting, but there's definitely like it's a big adjustment being a reliever versus being a starter. And I think some people don't understand how difficult that can be to maybe go back and forth, or just the idea of like some people go, oh, we can just make this starter a reliever when he comes up. That can be hard too. It's not necessarily the easiest transition from one to the other. So um, yeah, I'm not too worried about him being able to handle it, but command is going to end up still, to me, that's just going to be the big thing the whole time, is if he can command pitches well enough for long enough to be able to stay in a game as a starter.
Hmm. And then next, we've got the only other human being the Brewers acquired in this trade. Shortstop by trade, probably, Joey Ortiz. Spencer, what's your breakdown of him and kind of where do you see him fitting in with this Brewers team right now?
Yeah, so with the current construction of the team, I would expect Ortiz maybe third base, I guess. I would still lean, I'm hoping Tyler Black is the third baseman to start the year. Me personally, I'm hoping he's the starting second baseman on opening day for the Brewers this year. And we've talked before on the podcast about Terang and kind of a lack of belief in the bat. Obviously, he's a very good defender. Like Terang is a very, very good defensive player. The good news with Ortiz is that if he's not as good as, or I think he's as good as Terang, if not better defensively. This is one of the, I think he's probably got better range. I think his arm, I think, is going to be quite a bit better than what Terang has in the field. And I see him as the long-term shortstop for the Brewers unless they work out an extension with Willie, like we have kind of talked about at times. The big thing for me with Ortiz is that I think there's wide-ranging belief in the bat, and I know Gunnar, you might disagree a little bit with what I believe in the bat. To me, I see a guy who in AAA he didn't strike out much. He doesn't walk a ton, but he's taken walks. It's like an 8% walk rate, which is fine. That's about like what a Willie Adames is. Um, but the strikeout rate was 16 to 17% the last 3 years at the upper levels of the minors, which is he does chase, but he's got incredibly good bat to ball skills. If you're only striking out at a 16 to 17% rate, you can probably account for some inflation at the MLB level, like to the low 20s. That wouldn't be surprising. But I don't see him being a guy who's a big time strikeout machine, somebody who has issues with strikeouts. Um, but he hits the ball hard. He hits the ball extremely hard. 114.9 was his max exit velocity last season in AAA. I believe the only Brewer to break that last season was William Contreras, and only 30 hitters in all of baseball broke that number on a batted ball last season. He is somebody who makes incredible amounts of contact when it's in the zone. So it's an 88% zone contact rate, which would have been probably one of the better ones in the Brewers system, and especially for somebody who hits the ball as hard as he does. We're also looking at someone who can kind of spray the ball all over the field. If you look at a spray chart, it's he actually hits the ball to the opposite field a lot, which is always a little iffy. You always worry about that a little bit because you'd like to see somebody who can pull the ball with some power. But when you look at William Contreras's kind of spray chart over the last few years, it's kind of similar in that he hits the ball hard on the ground and to the opposite field a lot. It's a matter of if Ortiz can start getting to the elevation that like William Contreras started elevating the ball a little bit more as he went on in his minor league and then also his major league career. If he can do that, if Ortiz can do that, I am convinced that he could be a legitimate like above average hitter in MLB. Somebody who hits the ball, he had a average exit velocity of 91 miles per hour. He had a 90th percentile exit velocity of close to 106. Those are not small numbers. These are numbers of guys who hit the ball, who hit well in MLB. I actually have a comp that I got from Lucas on Twitter. His handle is WI for Wisconsin Guy 94. He brought up the comparison between Bo Bichette and Joey Ortiz. So obviously, when I talk about Bo Bichette as a comp for Ortiz, I'm not saying Ortiz is going to be Bo Bichette offensively, but I did find these numbers very, very interesting. And it does show the type of potential that Ortiz has at the plate. So this is going to be Bo Bichette's 2023 MLB numbers and then Ortiz's 2023 AAA numbers. So in terms of average exit velocity, Bo Bichette was 90.2 miles per hour and Ortiz was 90 miles per hour flat. Hard hit percentage, 44.9 for Bichette, 44.6 for Ortiz. 90th percentile exit velocity, 106.6 for Bichette, 105.5 for Ortiz. Sweet spot percentage, 38.3 for Bichette, 38.8 for Ortiz. Chase rate, 36.4 for Bichette, 32 for Ortiz. Whiff rate, 21.1% for Bichette, 16% for Ortiz. Strikeout rate 19.1 versus 17.7 for Ortiz. And then walk rate was 4.5 for Bichette and 8.2 for Ortiz. The big difference between the two is the barrel rate. So Bichette, obviously a home run hitter, he has more barrels than Ortiz by a decent amount. It was 9.6% for Bichette in MLB, and it was 2% for Ortiz in AAA. So the biggest thing Ortiz is going to have to do in order to become a legitimate, like, if he does this, and this is way easier said than done, but if he starts elevating the ball, there is an opportunity for him to be a legitimate, like, I would say maybe like a Dansby Swanson level of hitter. And that could be kind of similar to even if he really starts elevating the ball, then Bo Bichette type of hitter does probably come onto the table a little bit more. I think there's probably a level of a potential trade-off in terms of you start elevating a little bit and you might lose some of that. It's a lot harder to smash the ball into, or a lot easier to smash the ball into the ground hard than it is to elevate the ball with that same type of exit velocity. Gunner and I can tell you all about that. A lot of our hardest hit balls when we were in on hit tracks in the batting cage were balls that we just smoked right into the ground or a ground ball at least. Um, but it is something where you can see the path to a guy actually hitting for a decent amount of power. And at the very least, I could see him being a pretty big doubles guy. Like I said, he kind of spreads it around the field. He can hit to all fields. But if he can start pulling the ball in the air more often, we're talking a guy who could be a really, really good hitter. I'm not going to say the odds of that are super high, and I don't want everyone to think that I'm expecting that. Like I'm high on Joey Ortiz because I think it's possible. And I also think that someone who hits the ball as hard as he does in general is going to be an okay hitter. Combined with that defense that I talked about, where I think it's legitimately could be gold glove shortstop defense. Whereas I think Terang's probably more of a gold glove second baseman and a solid shortstop. I think this is a guy who could be really, really helpful to the team for the next 7 years of club control, 6, 7 years of club control. Um, I really, really hope he is the opening day second baseman for the Brewers. And I don't know. We'll get into it in a second. I think there were guys that probably would have been a little bit better than what we ended up getting if you were dreaming big. But personally, the two guys they got for me are a really nice mix of a pretty high floor because of Ortiz's defense and DL Hall's ability to probably just be a lockdown reliever, even if the command doesn't come around, and a mix of a pretty high ceiling if Ortiz can start elevating the ball a little bit more and Hall can command the ball a little bit better and be a starter. I mean, you're talking about guys who there's a wide range of outcomes, but the floor being high in a wide range of outcomes is not that it doesn't happen that often. And these guys both have that. So I feel pretty good about it. I talked a lot there. So Gunnar, I know you had a little bit, you're more on the hitting side of things, obviously. So
Hmm.
you were looking into Ortiz, and what were your thoughts on him?
Yeah, this is a guy who I definitely have some thoughts on. I think first, what I noticed when this trade broke, and I know you noticed it too, because I saw it, first saw it in your comments, and then me, like you said, digging into Ortiz more. I was kind of going to everybody's tweets and posting all of his stats and a lot of it was posting his defensive highlights. So a lot of Brewers fans took that as, oh, this guy can't hit. All we talk about is his defense. Well, that's his main attribute. Like that's what he's really good at. So yeah, that's probably what's going to get highlighted first. And you broke down all the numbers about his hitting and everything like that. I think it's a lot of it's more, yeah, you do have to read into it a little bit more for this type of guy. He doesn't, and he had like 800 OPS, so it's not like he's been like horrible. It's just, yeah, you had to read into it a little bit. But yeah, I mean, as far as his swing goes, like you said, I kind of looked at it a little bit more, and a guy with sort of a high leg kick. Normally, I think kind of the cliche, and you've talked about it in past episodes, is like, oh, this guy's gonna swing and miss. He's out of control, and that's exactly the opposite of what he does. Like you said, he mentioned the barrel rate and how hard he hits the ball. Obviously, I think I would just like to see him hit it in the air, like you mentioned too, because I can translate into home runs. I think he was just more of kind of like a doubles guy. I think that's kind of fair to say with the power, but
Yep.
we're not unfamiliar to that with the Brewers organization. That's kind of another guy who's kind of the bread and butter of what we do. Um, Kind of where we differ, and it's more my own anxiety and concern with him is when I don't see a guy who walks a ton, and I'll have another caveat to this too, but when you don't have a guy who walks a ton, I always get scared of that floor in a different way. Like he's got his own floor because he doesn't strike out and he always makes contact. So that's his floor is always making contact and always hitting well, but it always just feels like a safer floor for a guy who walks. So that concerns me a little bit, but another thing too is you look at the Brewers lineup, we have like a lot of guys who do already walk. So if he's the one guy who kind of strays from that, we've always been kind of asking for. I necessarily haven't been, but I guess Brewers fans in general, and I guess it's still true to a fact, but guys who make contact and hit and just are just good pure hitters, I think that's kind of what we're lacking a little bit. But we have always had guys who get on base and hit home runs. I mean, not hit home runs, but have a little bit of power. But he just kind of breaks a little bit from the norm in that sense. So I think even if I am worried about the walks, we have a bunch of other guys who can control that. And if he's doing his job hitting, I'm not really concerned about that. But yeah, I mean, kind of just my last question was, and you kind of answered it too. I expect him to kind of be at second base for obvious reasons. I want a certain guy at third base as well, but and there's another part here, but maybe there's another option that we could take. But I did see his highlights at third base, and that was actually kind of the first couple that I saw and he can really handle it over there. He is a super smooth, and it's not like a Luis Urias where like he can handle it and he can't really handle it, but it looks okay. He can like legitimately look like he looks like a third baseman, which is kind of shocking to me. But you mentioned obviously the shortstop too, and we'll get into kind of the Willie part of it. But a guy at the very least who can handle all three of those spots, and then we kind of had guys who we don't outside of shortstop, we don't know what the answer is at second or third base necessarily right now. So a guy who can handle it very easily at both, I think is a huge plus for us to have right now. So
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I mean, the defense, I'll put it in the description of the podcast, a link to a thread that I found with a bunch of defensive plays. He, if you want to talk smooth, I mean, this is one of the smoothest looking fielders I have seen in quite some time. But it's not, you used Urias, who I think Urias liked to fool Brewer fans into thinking he was a good defender because he would make diving plays and stuff. The reason Urias was making diving plays is because he got awful jumps and he got terrible reads off the bat. So then he was diving for balls that he probably should have just been able to take a step or two to get. That's not the case with Ortiz. This is going to be legitimate. He'll cover the ground he needs to. If he doesn't need to dive, he's not going to dive. But he made some plays that were just other like I couldn't really believe how easy he made them look. And the fact that his arm is borderline plus on top of it means that third should be, yeah, like you said, he should be able to handle third with no problem. And second, he would be an outlier in terms of the amount of arm strength he has playing second base because most of
Mhm.
those guys are on the left side of the infield. And that to me is more where the floor comes in for him is the defense. I know people don't like that because that's the floor of terrain, but I think the bat's floor is still higher than what you're
Oh, for
getting
sure.
from
Yeah.
terrain too. So um it's
Terrain was bad because his offense was so incredibly bad that it
yes,
actually became a negative. Probably even not even that horribly a negative. That's just how good his defense was. But
right.
a guy who can actually hit combined with that, and maybe even a little bit better at defense, which I don't even know how that's possible because Terrain's really good. But Terrain, I don't even know if he could handle a third like Ortiz could, if
He
even if that
no.
was a possibility. So I think that floor is there too. Um, I did want to end it on this, and you can, if you have more on him, you can go after me. But I just want to give you guys an insight into my brain here. I texted Spencer out every time I get a hitter, I always kind of compare him to like a swing that I just first pop up, and I thought of Kike Hernandez, and I'm like, well, that's just a swing. And then I kind of looked at Kike Hernandez's stats, and honestly, not super unrealistic for a type of hitter he is. I mean, a guy who like 15-ish home runs at like his best, didn't walk a ton, but like it was kind of just a good pure hitter, had some extra pop in there, and then that plus the defense that he presents, I will definitely take that for sure. It's, we kind of talked about off screen, so I just wanted to let people know how my brain works. I saw a swing, I'm like, that's Kike Hernandez, and I don't even know why that popped into my brain.
Yeah. Well,
But
no.
yeah.
You sent me that and I immediately looked and I was like, "Yep, he's right. You do that a lot. You send me a swing and you're like, first glance, he looks like him." And I look and I'm like, "Yep, that's 100% right." So, um, no, and I agree. I mean, if you get Kike's like prime offensive years out of Ortiz with his defense, I mean, that's probably like a 5 WAR player. Like that's a
Mhm.
guy who's a legitimate, really, really, really good player. If you get anything more than that offensively, then you're talking about a guy who's all-star level, like very good. I don't know that I would bank on that, but I do think that's within the range of outcomes, that's why it's a pretty exciting pickup for me. And then obviously there's one other part of the trade, which is that 34th pick. I think we talked about this when Jack was on during the mailbag episode and stuff. When, first of all, I do want to say both Jack and I were putting the number at like 1% or fewer that Burns was going to get traded. Um, I really, we both said we wanted it to happen. All of us said we wanted it to happen. But I was shocked when it came through that they did it because I did expect at this point to be going into the season with Burns. Um, that 34th pick is basically the compensation pick that they would have got for Burns if he left in free agency after the qualifying offer. They get it a year earlier. They get it without any of the risk that would have come with it, where he might have gotten hurt. You might have missed out on that chance because of something like that. So they took any of the risk out of that possibility, and they got the pick that they were going to get if they had moved him or if he had left in free agency. So a really, really nice addition. I talked about it a lot on that podcast. So it's just important because it gives you 2.5-ish million more towards your bonus pool, which allows you to be a lot more creative like they were this past draft. It also gives you an opportunity to pick basically at the end of the first round another player, which gives you a bigger pool to choose from and a better chance to get somebody you really like. So I think it's a bit of an underrated piece because some people are just like, oh, they would have got it no matter what at in this next, the next draft with the qualifying offer. We saw what happened to Brandon Woodruff. There's risk with the starting pitcher somehow, or not somehow, but out of nowhere getting hurt in a way that makes them have little to no value, at least in the year that they're going to be a free agent. So I think just removing the risk of that part of it and getting the pick that you were going to get anyway is a really nice little bonus to the trade that shouldn't be overlooked.
I didn't even know that we could trade those types of picks too, if I'm being completely honest. So I ran to you. I'm like, this is possible. We can actually do this.
It's the only picks you
Because
can.
yeah, I wonder if that was the hang up too in the trade because Burns, and we're going to get into his comments, but he kind of talked about how it's been secretly kind of been going on, which is not shocking. Obviously, they've been having Corbin Burns talks, even if no matter how serious they were of doing it, they're obviously having talks. They probably have talks about a bunch of players you don't hear about, but um, you got to wonder. Obviously, they got new ownership too. If that was kind of maybe the last piece, because I just think it takes a lot of the risk out of the trade, as you mentioned. Like we were going to get this type of pick. Granted, it's a whole different draft, so I mean
Yep.
maybe you can kind of talk to the draft class a little bit in broad terms after this, but that could be a factor into maybe if people are like, well, the 2025 class is better than 2024, like we should have waited. But I just think it takes so much risk out of this. And then the bare bones of it too is maybe you could have got a different prospect, but the cool part about this is now we get the draft. I mean, we can go over the players too, and we don't have to, but you can look for your guys yourselves of all the guys in that kind of range that we got. I think Tyler Black was in that range you mentioned or Jack mentioned last
Yep.
episode. Like we get now a full list of guys that we get to pick and we get to choose and scout and it's our own guy. So it's a little bit different than picking from somebody else's kind of crop. So I think that's a positive. But if you wanted to speak on that part, 'cause I saw a lot of comments like that of like,
Yeah.
and I don't know that part of the draft, but people were saying that 25 might be better than 24.
Yeah. And from what I've seen so far, I haven't been able to really dig in much to this draft class. I usually start doing it once the college season has actually gotten underway a little bit and we start seeing how people are doing. But for the most part, that is the consensus that next year's draft is better than this one. But I do think there's the sunk cost of, not sunk cost, but the value decreases in terms of like a potential pick down the future. Like we see it in the NBA and the NFL, right? Like teams are more willing to move future picks than the ones that they have that year. There's more value to a team in that moment to have that pick right away and to get somebody into the system and to get somebody right away that they like and that they can work with. And yeah, you made a good point that I think some people probably would have preferred seeing like another name in the middle of their system. Or yeah, I would say the value of this pick in the Orioles system is probably a borderline like top 10 prospect in their system, which is it's a great system. It in other systems it might be higher than that. Um, but like you said, if the Brewers weren't big fans of that type of group of players that they had there, this allows them to go out and find a guy they like. This allows them to maneuver the draft where it could turn into that type of bonus money could help them get three or four different players that they like that they wouldn't have been able to get later in the draft because they wouldn't have had the money to offer. Um, it allows a lot more flexibility. So I think the bonus pool money is the most important part of that pick. But also, like I said, it gives you an opportunity to have more players available to you at that pick just by having an earlier pick too. Um, yeah, I don't have too many specifics on the draft class yet, but it is what other people have said is pretty much the consensus. It is supposed to be a weaker class than 2025. And then just in terms of Brewers that have been picked in that range, Black was, you're right. I think he was the 33rd pick, so one pick before this. And Josh Nath, I believe, was the 32nd pick in this last year's draft. So give or take a couple picks probably on that. I'm not 100% sure, but they, I mean, those are guys that you could see Black could be on the major league roster this year, only 3 years after being drafted. He could be a potential rookie of the year candidate right away from that draft class. And Nath is seen as one of the highest ceiling pitchers in that entire class. So there's going to be talent available at that pick. And I think there's a decent chance you could get more than what you were going to get out of adding any of their other prospects to this by giving yourself more room to choose who you want, to choose how you disperse the money. I think there's a lot of value in that. So I'm happy they got that part of the trade.
Mhm. Well, now that we've gone over the players that we've gotten, this is a trade, so we do have to value it as who, not necessarily who won the trade or who lost it, but we do have to kind of grade the trade package as a whole. Um, do you think this trade was one, fair value? Because I know that was kind of a big hot topic. And two, I know that we've talked about the Orioles in past episodes. Like I said, not maybe as much as we should have, but I know we touched on it. And at the very least, you've tweeted about it or talked to me about maybe another guy maybe you wanted. But did you like this package? Was there somebody else that maybe you're hoping that the Brewers could have gotten instead of maybe the guy that we got or the guys that we got?
Yeah. So Kobe Mayo was always the name that was first to come to mind for me for that trade. I was hoping he would be the headliner. Frankly, as time went on, it felt like that was less and less likely, but that was kind of my like dream scenario in a trade with Orioles. I think so. If I were grading, let's look at it. I'll give a grade. I think it's a B plus trade in terms of the return. If you could have got Mayo, I would have given it an A. If the Orioles were stupid enough to give Mayo and Ortiz and Hall or something, then that's probably your A plus type of trade. Um, Mayo to me is somebody who's going to help their team right away this year and fits into what they need on their roster. Whereas Hall was probably going to be helpful, but not as important for them. Ortiz is blocked by, at short, he's blocked by Gunnar Henderson and Jackson Holliday. And at second, you're probably figuring one of those two is going to play the other spot there. So it was going to be hard for him to find a real role there, which made him somewhat expendable from the Orioles' perspective. But I think sometimes people view that as like, oh, the Brewers are just getting scraps or something like that along those lines. Like, that's not what this is. Those two had value to every organization in baseball. They just maybe had a little bit less to the Orioles. These are two guys that most teams would be pretty excited to add to their system. Um, so in terms of it being fair value, I absolutely think it's fair value. That's as I thought about it more, this is more kind of what I figured the type of value would be. Honestly, the pick maybe puts it a little bit over what I would have expected for the value. But yeah, I mean, I if Mayo could have somehow been included in the deal, that would have been the dream, and I would have been fine replacing Ortiz with Mayo. I would have been happy doing that, I should say. But I did at one point in October, somebody actually asked me about a package for a Burns trade to the Orioles, and Ortiz was one of the names I put up there with Mayo as a guy I would really be happy to see headlining it. So, like I said, I've kind of always been I've probably been higher on Ortiz than a lot of people, but um, I was pretty excited to see his name included.
Mhm. I personally, I think it is a fair value trade. I mean, you broke it all down and said everything I was going to say, a little bit of it, but I mean, one, I think the pick is the wash, obviously, and then it comes down to how you value Corbin Burns, I guess, in one season. And we've had this talk 20 million times in this podcast. So I don't need to go over all of it again, but we think his trajectory was going down a little bit, and even if he had the same season he had last year, I guess it just depends on how valuable you think that is for one season. If that's worth it to you for kind of like a go for it type of move, I guess maybe it just depends how much you value him. But to us, I see guys like Ortiz and Hall. I see like a number six next to their name of like 6 years of control left. And if you can hit on one of them and kind of the way that we just projected them to be in their best case scenario, I think you've already kind of won that trade, assuming that we kind of pick a guy that we want in the draft too. I think there's a good chance that both of them hit too, in terms of their value or whatever, what they could be. So, and we mentioned it earlier too, as just kind of a last point. It was, I don't know what word it is, but I guess it made sense to keep Corbin Burns, and there was always an argument for it. And even I kind of sorted towards the end of all these moves, it was kind of just like, yeah, I guess there is a window to keep him. Like it does make sense, but I don't think this diminishes us from winning at all. Maybe we'll touch on this part later, but I just think we can still easily win with this trade. Um, and maybe in a future podcast, we'll go over like the starting rotation and stuff and how it looks now going forward. But I still think we're very capable of winning. So I don't think it really moved the needle that much further away from the path that we were already on. Um, but that's also my brain. Like I said, we don't really value Corbin Burns like maybe other people do because he has the Cy Young Award, and that doesn't really mean a ton to me at this point. But in text, I wanted to wrap this question up because I knew what your answer was going to be. I'm being honest, guys. I asked him a question that I knew the answer to, but um, we I knew once the trade went down that Spencer did kind of highlight Mayo, and I know Jack might even mention that earlier in the podcast. I just seen his name a lot, and I kind of raised the question to Spencer, and I'll raise it again here live on the podcast. If you had a choice, would you rather have just Mayo because we are very high in him, or would you rather have the package that we got?
Yeah. So if it is just Mayo versus this package, I would absolutely take this package of the two players and the pick. Um, like I said, if you even I could have been talked into like downgrading Hall to somebody else lower on the prospect totem and then upgrading Ortiz to Mayo in this type of deal, and then I probably still would have said I'd prefer the deal with Mayo in it. But I do think there's an element of the Brewers needed a shortstop of the future that they have that's legitimately ready or close to ready for MLB. I'm still a big Eric Braun Jr. believer, which everybody on here knows because I talk about it way too much. But I do think that this is a much, much safer bet to be that future shortstop. And everyone knows this as well who's listened. I don't believe Terang is that guy at all. I don't, if Bryce Terang's my starting shortstop moving forward, I'm not feeling good about that at all. So, the fact that they were able to add a guy that I believe can be and would be at least a solid shortstop for the future, I'm pretty happy about that. And if it ends up that he's the second baseman because they extend Willie, or let's say one of the other prospects actually does blow up and proves that he deserves the starting spot, great, that's even better. But for now, I'm pretty happy that they were able to add a guy that I would feel comfortable taking over short if Willie does this ends up being Willie's last season, which there's at least a good chance of.
Hmm. I think now we got to compare sort of where these guys would rank in our system is kind of how I kind of thought about it. And you mentioned Hall, he's not necessarily a prospect anymore, so it's not like this is actually true to what it actually would do. But where do you see these guys rank in our system if you just had to lay it out? You don't have to go through every top 10 list that you got or whatever, but do these guys maybe crack the top five of prospects that we have already? And if so, like who do they pass in comparison?
Yeah, so I'm not going to give everybody that I have in my top whatever, but I'll just read off my top five here and then I'll talk about whether they would pass any of them. So it's Jackson Churio, it's Jefferson Cairo, Jacob Mizorowski, Tyler Black, and then Luis Lara. And then Robert Gasser is my sixth. So I throw in Gasser because I think that's the guy that I would probably put both of them over. And I could see an argument for Lara being over, or for Ortiz being over Lara right now. Um, I think the risk with Hall is makes it hard for me to pop him up. That I do think there's a decent chance he's a reliever, and even a Josh Hader level reliever is not as valuable as a starter is under no matter what. Like it's no matter how good he is in that role, a good starter is better. But I would say they're both very borderline top five. I may need to update this a little at some point here because Wilkin has grown on me more and he might be cracking my top five at this point too. But in any case, I would put him in like that 5 to 7 range, both of them. Um, to me, that's two really good additions in a trade. When you can, this is a good system. The Brewers are a good system. And I mean, I was going to talk about it at the end, but Baseball America just ranked the system the number two system in baseball. They've done all of this while never rebuilding, while competing this entire time, and they've created a top five system by pretty much every measure. I think you being able to add two guys that are borderline top five to that type of level of system is pretty impressive for a guy who is 1 year. It's a 1 year deal. It's a 1 year deal for a guy who's been closer to good than great for the last 2 years. And a 1 year deal for a guy who's not going to extend unless you make him the highest paid pitcher in the history of baseball. That's there's not that much leverage that the Brewers have in that type of scenario.
I'm
It
not even sure he would extend, honestly. I mean, in that case, maybe, but he made it pretty clear he wasn't coming back.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I mean I everyone knew the Brewers weren't giving him that. I think
Yeah,
another team
obviously.
maybe it's on the table, but he wants Garrett Cole plus some. Like that's what he wants. He wants to be known as the highest paid pitcher in baseball history. I have plenty of thoughts on Corbin Burns and we'll get into that a little bit later, but um the fact that they were able to get two guys that I view as one borderline top five prospects in this system and two guys that are going to impact this year's team and potentially in a really, really big way while also adding that draft pick. I feel very good about what they did here. And yeah, to me they're both borderline top five, which is pretty good.
Yeah, and you nailed it on the head too. I mean, we have a good system. So I think I saw a ranking. I can't remember which one it was. And obviously, we talked about Hall's not really considered a prospect anymore. And I think we might have even had, even if you don't include him, I saw one place that we had the most top 100 now. I think they probably snuck in Gasser at the very end or something like that. You probably remember what place it was, but that's like seven guys right there. That's not even including Hall, who's probably a fringe 100 guy if you include him. So
Yeah,
we
that
far and
was
away.
that was Baseball America, and they do
Yeah.
include DL Hall because they do things
Okay.
differently than everyone else. So
So Gasser is probably left out then, or
no,
one of them
Gasser made
was?
it too.
Okay.
They're both on it. They're both like 93 and 96 or something. So it's
Okay.
back of the I will just to explain why that happens. The rookie eligibility is like you have a certain amount of at bats or innings pitched that you reach, or 45 days of service time. Baseball America is the only one that doesn't use the service time one. So they only take you off their list when you have reached either 150 at bats or 50 innings pitched. And he hasn't quite gotten to that 50 innings pitched. Technically, Garrett Mitchell is still on their list for them because he hasn't even had 150 at bats yet. So that's weird because everyone else, Garrett Mitchell's been long gone from their list, but he's
Hmm.
on there still. But he's not
So,
top 100, so he doesn't count towards
so
that
Garrett
total.
could win Rookie of the Year, you're basically saying.
Nope. Not by
I,
MLB rules. Baseball America might grant it to him.
I know, I know. But yeah, switching over because those are good points. Switching over to we mentioned early on what Ortiz is, and he is kind of a natural shortstop by trade. So the obvious question is to that, and you kind of mentioned it for the future. On paper, he's the shortstop of the future, because Willie Thomas isn't locked up. Do you think this kind of changes? We don't know what the plan is, quote unquote. We don't know what they're planning to do with Willie Adames. Kind of the same vibes of Corbin, but what do you expect now to kind of happen? How would you handle the Willie Adames situation? Has it changed at all since we've talked about it?
I don't think it's changed. Um, my first goal would still be to extend Willie and to make Ortiz one of the, I mean, just an insanely good defensive second baseman who can also have some pop. I mean, Willie Adames and Ortiz up the middle could be the best middle infield defense in baseball, and frankly, it might not be that close. Um, if you were to put, I think I saw somebody tweet this or a scout said this. Yeah, it was a Kurt Hogue article. He said that a scout told him that if you put Ortiz at third, Adames at short, and Terang at second, which wouldn't be my ideal starting lineup, but it could be a fun like closing lineup when you need defense. He said even if Rhys Hoskins is playing first, where he's not a good defender, he's like that's the best infield and defense or defensive infield in baseball by far. Like those three playing defense in one infield, the grounders are not getting through. They're going to be turned into outs at a very, very high rate. And I think if you can still keep Willie and make Ortiz that second baseman long term, or maybe he does end up being the third baseman. Say Black's defense doesn't cut it there and he moves to first or he DHs or the outfield or whatever. Either way, you're either going to have Willie and Ortiz on the left side playing incredible defense or Willie and Ortiz up the middle playing incredible defense. That's super important. And like you said, we're not going to touch much on how the roster has been affected in general, but the pitching is going to be worse. And the better defense you can play behind pitching that's not as good, or at least not as like strikeout heavy, the better. So having that capability behind those guys for a while, that could be really, really valuable. And that would still be my first plan of attack. If he is completely against an extension, I guess I can't rule out the like if somebody came to me with a trade offer that blew me away, then yeah, I think it would be smart to do it in that scenario. I'm not just trading Willie to trade him, and I don't know that his value would be nearly as high as what I would want to be willing to trade him. I think he's the candidate still for if he doesn't get extended, you play him through the year unless you suck and you end up having to trade at the deadline. But you play him through the year and you give him the qualifying offer and you take the pick for him. But I think the value that he brings to this year's team, which, like you said, this team's going to still be trying to compete. They're not going to be taking a year off because of this trade. I think there's confusion again from national media who does not understand how the Brewers operate. And I don't get it because it's been 5 years of them doing this basically. They do this. This is what they do. They trade guys before they leave, and they do it in a way that keeps them competitive at the same time. And it's worked. They keep winning the division. They keep making the playoffs. Now, playoff success is one thing. We know that. It's a little more random once you get there, but they're putting themselves in the dance every single time. And I think Willie is an important part of doing that this year. So unless somebody comes with a crazy offer, trade is my last resort. I guess I would say it that way is my, unless somebody's just insanely, they come and they're like, hey, we'll give you three starting pitching prospects that are in the majors, ready to go. They're going to help you completely overhaul that rotation that's now a little shorter. Like, sure, maybe that makes some sense because you now have a shortstop, but I'd still prefer to hold him.
Yeah, I mean, people know my answer. Obviously, I'd want to hold them, but I do think the door after this type of trade, I always get very excited when we get good prospects, then I like kind of like, well, now I can kind of imagine this a world where I would be more okay with it. Um, because I do think that we could still technically compete, and I think this next part does kind of tangle in here with what I'm about to say kind of tangles in with the next question I wanted to ask you because I think a trade of Willie might signal people are probably gonna, this is might be a hot take-ish, but I think people probably disagree with this statement. But I think a Willie trade might signal more to the team that we're not going to compete versus like a Corbin getting traded. And I don't even know if that's super true, but to me, because I know what kind of what it would mean, I think that kind of signals it a little bit more. But how I'm going to tie it into this next question I've got for Spencer is, uh, because we did get a shortstop in this trade and he's major league ready. We have money now that's kind of freed up here, and we saved about 15-ish million. I guess might be a little bit less than that, but I think there's now a window where we could have him play shortstop and maybe sign somebody else, trade for somebody else. Who knows? I think because before we talked about that backup option with Bryce Durang, I did not want to watch him playing shortstop, but I would enjoy watching Ortiz playing shortstop now. Um, and to speak on Durang quick before I do kind of switch over to that part of it is I think now I don't like Trank still, but I think him in a utility role, and we don't have to talk about the roster, but that would excite me more. And you kind of mentioned it again of if we can kind of have Trank just utility, and then say Tyler Black is our starting in third baseman, and then you could shift over Ortiz to third, and then all of a sudden bring Turang in for the second, and that's how we end the games. We've done that in the outfield with like Weimer towards the end of the year and stuff. So that's a huge, huge asset to have because we don't even need Tranks bad at that point. So I think there is probably more of a role for him then. Um, but yeah, I think now we should switch over to kind of the next question I've got for Spencer is given that we've saved about $15 million in this deal, is there kind of an increased possibility for another signing or an extension somewhere?
Yeah, I did. I do think that's a super interesting part of the equation here because the Brewers' payroll is now sitting at like 102 million, I believe is what I saw. They've been up closer to 130 the last couple of years, which means it went down a little bit last year, but 2 years ago it was about 130. And it did make me wonder if that was a potential possibility that they might go out and try and add another bat, like we talked about with Jack. Maybe Matt Chapman is willing to go for like a 1 year, I don't know, 25 million, something along those lines where it gets you back closer to where the payroll has been. Um, it would be like it wouldn't just fit into the 15 million that they got rid of for Burns. I think he would cost more than that, but you never know. I could see I, I don't think Jorge Soler would be very likely. Um, that would surprise me, but he would be like a really, really nice DH up. Like Rhys Hoskins at first and Jorge Soler as your DH would be a very, very good middle of the order. And it would give you quite a bit more power than you've been getting from some of the guys that we've had in the middle of our order. I'm not sure what other did JD Martinez sign yet? I
No.
could I could see him being like a 1 year DH type guy where I mean I in my head I keep thinking that they haven't really had a DH only type of player, but they Andrew McCutchen was. He hardly played the
Yeah.
field.
Winker was supposed to sort of be in a
Winker
way.
was supposed to be. Yeah, like they've been a little more open to it than I kind of thought they would be. Um, it would make it even more difficult, I think, to juggle the lineup if you do have a DH only type guy who hits most of the time. But I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world to do it still. Um, I don't know. I'm not sure there's many starter options that make a lot of sense for this type of like 1 year, maybe 2 year deal at this type of money. But it wouldn't shock me if they see an opportunity to add somebody who they think could be like, you know, 85% of what Burns was and just take that slight step back, but also take what they got in that return and then also not fall off too far in that regard. Maybe they see somebody along those lines that they're interested in. I don't even know. I think it's like Montgomery and Snell and a few others left, and those guys are not taking 1 year pillow type contracts that aren't. I mean, they'd be looking for huge, huge money in that type of deal, but I, I think they probably do. Now, along the Willie Adames talk, I wonder if they put that 15 million towards an extension. So I think it's important to note that in baseball, it is not like basketball or football where the cap matters and like carrying over money doesn't really do much for you in terms of like how it works out compared to what your budget is. It in baseball, if you don't spend the 15 million this year, it could be helpful for the future because it's just part of a big, wide-ranging, like this is all the money you have available to you. If they put the 15 million towards part of a Willie Adames extension, I would say that's money well spent, even though it wouldn't raise the payroll this year, unless maybe they made it part of the deal where Willie gets a raise right away and this season too. But it wouldn't affect this year's payroll, but it would be money that helped go towards an extension for a guy that I would like to see stick around. So I don't know, Gunnar, did you have anybody else that kind of stood out to you? Or I mean, like we said, it could be Tyler Black extension, somebody along those lines. I'm
Hmm.
sure that would make you happy. It would make me happy too. Um, but I guess I'd say I'm hoping that the money doesn't just sit there. I think that would be, while I understand that there's a lot of moving parts, like the Bally Sports thing matters in this equation. The Brewers don't really know if they're getting their TV money. They're supposed to, but I think there's some up in the air qualities to that where it's probably not guaranteed that they're going to get paid what they're expecting to get paid. So I get it, but I do think it would be a little disappointing if you don't go out and use this money that you just freed up to at least add something to this year's team.
Yeah, I didn't even consider sort of the younger guys again taking like a Cheerio approach because that's actually a good idea too if you believe in one of them. Um, just like you believed in Jackson, obviously that guy is an anomaly, so he's not really even on those guys' level. But that's an interesting thought. I do think I'll make a slight prediction. I do think how you just laid it out too even kind of confirmed what I was thinking. I think that Willie will sign an extension now because you said he's not going to perfectly fit into that $15 million, but in a way, he did kind of help you save a little bit of money there. And then, yeah, I mean, even going forward with the cap, I mean, like there's not a cap, but there's salaries. Um, Going in forward even to next year, I mean, even if you don't think that obviously the only guy that's going to bump up that contract if we did sign somebody right now would be Willie Adames that we know for sure if next year. So that money's still going to be there next summer or next fall, I guess. I'm thinking of basketball. Um, so I think you don't necessarily have to do something right now. And I mean, you went over the names. Obviously, the one guy I wanted, and that's why I was kind of alluding to it, was Matt Chapman, because now you can kind of see a world if you trade Willie and you get signed to Matt Chapman and you can put Ortiz at short. You didn't really lose much there as far as offensively, at least on paper. You don't know how they're going to perform, but I could see a world like that too. But that's also like the best case scenario. If you don't get Matt Chapman and you do that, what are you looking at now? And I think that was just kind of my point too of why I was saying that it looks worse on paper because it's like you got Reese, and yeah, you could, like I said, on paper we can make it work. We could trade Willie and it still looks fine. But the cool part about getting Reese was, and I laid it out in that last episode, is you look at the lineup now. It's like, oh, that's a super super nice lineup. If you trade Willie, you're kind of just like, oh, we subbed out a good hitter for a good hitter. Like, and I know Reese probably projects better than Willie even, but it's just like, what did we really gain that much? Obviously, you're banking on Jackson being, we don't even have high expectations for Jackson, but moderate expectations. But a lot of guys unproven that we could still see, but it's just hard to sell to the players. I feel like in that more aspect rather than it's like a Corbin Burns because, yeah, I mean, people look at the Cy Youngs and stuff, but or one Cy Young. And then I look at the downward trajectory. I think that you can easily replace that more than I'm going to rip out a good hitting shortstop right now, even though we just got a good bat. But um, I guess, yeah, that was just my point with this thing is I don't see a lot of options free agency wise. I think if it's not Matt Chapman or something like that and you trade Willie, I think you're just kind of forcing at that point. I'd rather just kind of kick the can, try to give Willie an extension. You brought up a good point of like the young guys. If you do believe in Tyler Black that much, I would do that. And it's not going to be, I wonder how much you even think that would be because it wouldn't even be Jackson Cheerio numbers, even. It couldn't have
No,
be.
I
So, I mean,
I saw that Colt Keith extension that the Tigers gave Colt Keith. Um, but I would think it would be more in line with that. Like that's kind of
yeah.
more the prospect level that Black is, and that was pretty reasonable. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they're at least going to explore what they can do. I like you said, the options aren't great, so if they I don't want them to just spend the money to spend it,
Hmm.
especially for multiple years. Um, and I think there's an opportunity, and like he says it every year. Mark and Matt Arnold say it every year, and people get mad about it. But the ability to not have reached what you consider your budget limit at the deadline is pretty valuable to be able to know that you can add money at the deadline and potentially add somebody that you at that point in the season, now you know really what you need and what would help the team. And they've done a pretty good job for the most part adding players that do help the team at the deadline. I think that there is value to having that kind of ability at the deadline, but I would still like to see them. I'm hoping they're exploring all these options. I'm hoping they've reached out to some of those DH names like, hey, a 1 year deal where we get you a lot of at bats, put you in a good position, put you in the middle of our order with Rhys Hoskins and a bunch of young guys around you and Willie Adames. That seems like it'd be a pretty enticing offer to somebody who's going to try and get another big contract the next year. So who knows? But I guess for me, is there, I know we didn't want to talk about the roster too much, but how about we look at it one other person that is starting to get rumored now a little bit more again, and that's Devin Williams. Um, do you think that now a Devin Williams trade would make a little bit more sense, or do you think it might make less sense now because of the fact that obviously the rotation is going to be a little bit worse, so now the bullpen might be relied upon even more? What are your thoughts on Rosenthal? Threw it out there that he thinks it's more on the table now, but Rosenthal seems to think the Brewers are going to trade everybody at all times. So I don't know what to buy or what to believe in that scenario.
Yeah, he definitely thinks we're quote selling. But yeah, I mean that was kind of my that's why I didn't really want to put him down. And you're right, it was hyped up a lot that he could get traded now. I just don't. The package it's always going to be for me. If the package is good, I would take it. But I do think now we're going to rely a little bit more bullpen and taking away Devin, who we now have locked up if we want for the next 2 seasons. It's not like, and we want to kind of trade him at the end of this season anyways. But I just don't think the clock necessarily is as like urgent where I don't think you lose the value. Like I wanted to trade Corbin. Well, I don't even know what it would be now. Beginning of last season, that off season, because I think the value did kind of take a hit in that
Mhm.
1 year, but I don't think the value is going to take as big of a hit for Devin in a year if we trade him next off season, unless he has an injury or he's not as good. But yeah, I don't think I would necessarily do that. What would you do?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I think it's if the offer is there and it blows you away, like I will say DL Hall might make it a little easier because I do think worst case scenario, like I said, I think I shouldn't say worst case scenario, but a relatively safe floor projection for him is a high leverage reliever.
Mhm.
And if you just decide, hey, we're going to make him that Josh Hader role right away, he's going to be a high leverage guy for us right away. Abner's our closer now and we get good value for Devin, and that might include another reliever of some sort or something along those lines. Like you never know what the package would be, but it does come down to me for just it's got to be the right package. I I would be surprised if they get it. And like you said, I think value wise, it's higher now than it will be in a year, but I don't think it's as big of a difference as people might think. Like relievers go at the deadline for huge packages sometimes because of how much teams value them and how badly they tend to need them at the back end of their pen. And somebody like Devin, who's multi-time reliever of the year, unless he has a bad season, he's going to have a ton of value next offseason anyway. And that's again when I would expect it to happen next offseason. It'll be the same thing I thought for Burns this whole offseason that I was up until a few weeks ago. I would have been shocked if they didn't trade Burns. Then the Hoskins thing kind of changed things, but if they go into next offseason and don't trade Devin Williams, I'll be absolutely floored. I would be really, really surprised. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm with you. I think it's probably still really unlikely, but in the right deal, you never know what might come around. But it's the same thing with everybody. Honestly,
Mhm.
every player on the team is in that scenario, other than maybe I don't think Churio's getting traded right after extension, but
Yeah.
everybody else is pretty much right package, right time. You never know.
Mhm. I do have. We're talking too much, but I don't care anymore. It's the Corbin Burns. He got traded. I don't care. People are here to listen to us, but um, I have a. You mentioned one. I think why we waited to trade Corbin was for a specific reason, and we've kind of been getting tidbits of why we didn't do it and maybe why we wouldn't have done it. There's an obvious answer to that, and well, not an obvious answer. The point is that there isn't an obvious. There's a reason someone had to check off on this trade happening, and we're not going to have an answer to why that happened, but do you have any thoughts? Because there's rumors I know on previous episodes of us talking about Mark doesn't want to do this because of how it looked to the Josh Hader. Like I said, we're not going to have unless you got a source that you're not going to tell us about and you know what Mark was thinking and how he maybe decided to finally do this. I guess again, that's not even a good question because you can't answer it for sure. But why do you think maybe, and are you proud of Mark? I guess is maybe a better question because that one we can answer. Um, are you proud of him for finally being like, you know what, we're doing the right move for the organization? And you kind of talked about too of it seems like Mark is starting to overstep a little bit his role. I think that's a big part of it too because this kind of showed that this is Matt's team and he can actually do what he wants.
Yep, that's exactly where I was going with that. I think it's very important to me that Mark, obviously, the owner is going to have involvement in the team and in decisions, and they need to be clued in on everything that's going on. But it bothers me a lot if the owner thinks that he should be GM and he's playing GM from behind him, basically, and he's using the GM as like a puppet. Like that, I don't like that. I think Mark had that problem early in his tenure as an owner. And believe me, if I owned a baseball team, do you know how hard it would be to just give the reins to somebody who, like, I'm watching all this happen. They're spending my money. They're doing things with the team I own, and I might not agree with all of them, but I'm supposed to trust them with what they're doing. That'd be super hard. And I think it's probably underrated how difficult that would be for an owner to do that. I do think the best owners do that though. And if he wants to be considered one of the better owners, I think he has to continue to do that. And like you said, I think this is a really good sign that he is probably maybe giving Matt control instead of just going like we heard last year with the Colton Wong trade. Like he said no to a prospect package from the Red Sox because he didn't want to take a step back. In the end, it may have been there's a pretty decent chance that was a better deal for the Brewers, given that Winker ended up being pretty awful and Toro got traded for a minor league reliever after the season. So I think maybe that type of example helped him understand like, hey, Matt knows what's going on. Let's let him do this thing. Let him be the guy. But it is funny because Corbin said on that Foul Territory show yesterday that when Mike Elias, the GM for the Orioles, called him, he kind of told him that the Brewers were listening early in the offseason, and then they stopped. They said, no, we're not going to trade him. And then suddenly he heard that the Brewers were listening again. So then he revisited it. I'm not sure I buy everything Corbin says on every level, but it is interesting and it would be a weird thing to lie about. I wonder if Mark got a little involved during the middle of the offseason and then Matt was able to bring in Hoskins and was like, listen, I can keep us competitive while also moving Corbin. He's like, I promise we have Hoskins now. We've got this lineup. Like, we can make this Burns deal and still be competitive. And I wonder if that was able to maybe sell him a little bit more on it. And that's why he was more open to it. Who really knows? But I do think it's good to see that going that direction again. And I will say, yes, in terms of like, I don't know how proud I can be in a billionaire. But I think it's a good sign for him as an owner that he was able to kind of swallow his pride and allow this to happen because I genuinely do believe this is the right thing for the Brewers. And I think it needed to happen if they really do want to keep the window open as long as they are probably attempting to do. So good on him for it. I'm not going to say I'm proud of him, but good job, Mark.
I'm proud of you, Mark. I'll say it. Um, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned kind of Corbin's actions, and now we're going to go into the more open-ended section of this podcast where we figured we'd have some longer rants, or at least I know Spencer has been kind of brewing up with Corbin Burns content, but Corbin obviously gets traded, and I don't have a big problem with him going on like a platform and talking. I think we're kind of used to him doing that, and it is cool when players do that, so I don't really care with that. It's a nice way to kind of like look into like their world a little bit. And it is cool that he kind of hopped on pretty much as fast as he could. Looked like he was like sitting in like a Milwaukee parking lot somewhere. I was trying to figure out where maybe he was talking from, but yeah, he had some comments, and like I said, this is open-ended suspense. So you can kind of take this any way you want. You can talk about his comments, you can talk about his time with the Brewers, whatever. But I guess personally, I didn't super love some of his comments. Really, not even just yesterday or whatever it was, but we can date this back to when the whole arbitration stuff went down. Like he just has this sort of vibe to him where he's kind of him over the team a little bit. And I just don't appreciate that type of guy, if I'm being completely honest. It is hard to kind of root for someone like that. And I'm not saying he's a bad teammate. I mean, we'll let the players if they ever do, and if they probably won't because he probably was a good teammate. Like whatever. I can't speak to that part of it, but it just kind of always seems like he he loves himself a little bit too much. I think I texted that to Spencer. Um, and rightfully so. I mean, he's got a Cy Young Award trophy sitting in his trophy case that he can look at whenever he goes into the office. So, um, I would probably be feeling myself a little bit too, but I'm just not going to miss a type of guy like that. I think I love. We talked about some of the other stars that we love. Like, I mean, Yelich on this team. He's a great guy, great teammate. That he very makes it much known that he's like all for like the young guys and everything. Like we, again, I can't be in the locker room and stuff, but he makes it known like he wants to be known as a nice guy and a guy like that, and people like him. So Giannis, Dame, like we can go over all the stars that we've had, like Jordan Love now. I mean, guys who they just are a good example of people, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I can't speak to his character, but I just didn't appreciate him. I won't really miss him, um, his comments and stuff like that. And I think lastly, I think what's just kind of always rubbed me the wrong way is he kind of along the lines of like him and like putting himself over the team, at least vibes like that. This is a guy who I was super excited that we called him up. Like I thought he was going to be a top, like he was. He ended up being a Cy Young Award winner, but at the time, if people probably have forgotten about this section of his career where he was obviously a lights out bullpen reliever and kind of like we talked about with Hall, we were excited to have him start the next season and he did horrible. He had one of the probably the worst seasons that you could possibly have as a starter. And Spencer can probably talk to a little bit more of the nitty gritty to why and everything like that. But I know for a fact that we helped his career go to where it was going to go. Like we made you into a Cy Young Award. You had all the stuff and you had the capabilities of doing it, but you got to give some credit to the team and like don't forget who made you and who turned you into that. So I think that's what kind of rubs me the wrong way. Um, and yeah, I mean, Spencer, you can kind of take it whatever. I would probably touch on most of it, but yeah.
Yeah, it's for me. I actually had a tweet during the game one of that wild card series against the Diamondbacks, and I said, no matter what happens tonight and the rest of the postseason, the Corbin Burns trade this offseason is going to be the easiest loss of a good player from one of my teams that I've ever experienced. Maybe the most frustrating Brewer I've watched. He's left so much ability on the table. And it's more than just that ability part. I don't like his pitch mix. We talked about that in the mailbag thing. I think he could have I will say this, the Orioles might be able to convince him to do something different. Maybe some new, like a new set of voices. It's possible he will have a bit of a breakout again with the Orioles by changing up the pitch mix, buying into what they're telling him just because it's new people with new ideas. That's fine. That might happen, and that's on the table as a possibility here. I don't think it was happening in Milwaukee. It didn't seem like he was going to change anything here. And for me, that 2019, like you said, not only was he terrible, the Brewers kept giving him chances that year. They kept trying to make it work, and it just wasn't. And eventually they gave up and they kept him in AAA for the last like couple months of the season. But they kept trying to give him opportunities. And then you go into that offseason, and I think a lot of teams came calling that year trying to get Burns off their hands. And instead of trading him and giving up on him, instead the Brewers publicly, and they don't do this very often, stood by him and told people that they believed he was going to be a star pitcher. They still believed that he was going to be a star. They weren't like, oh, I think he could figure it out and be pretty good for it. No, they said publicly that they believed he was going to be a star still. I don't know how much more you can ask for an organization when you are throwing up a 9 ERA in a season for them to stand by you and to stick up for you publicly like that. Now, there's selfish reasons for the Brewers to do that, but they don't have to do it. They did not have to do it, and they could have very easily said, yeah, maybe he's just a reliever and just decided to go that route. They very easily could have been unwilling to change his pitch mix to a cutter. The thing is, Corbin Burns thought that what he was doing was only related to his command in 2019, which makes me think Corbin Burns thinks he's a lot smarter than he actually is because the pitch shape that he had on the fastball was fine and it would have worked better up at the top of the zone and above. But him finding that cutter and the Brewers convincing him to lean into that is what changed his career. It completely changed his career at that point. And I don't know that he discovers that on his own. Now, I think a lot of people, like if he had gone to Driveline in an offseason, they probably would have discovered it. There's a decent amount of organizations who would have. But the fact that the Brewers did all of that in terms of standing up for him, sticking up for him, putting out pretty big expectations for him and standing by them while it was going very, very poorly. And then they're the team that discovers that you should probably lean into this cutter that turns you into a Cy Young. And then they have one arbitration case where they make a case against you because you had a 4.5 ERA in the second half of the season and did hurt the chances to make the playoffs, and you just completely flip your tone on them for the next couple of years. And basically, any chance you have, you take a back. There were so many backhanded compliments or just like kind of quiet complaints or quiet knocks on the organization he made the last couple of years. I understand where his frustration came from on some of those things, and I don't blame him for having a little bit of frustration. Any good teammate is going to hide that a lot better than he did. And like you said, I guess we don't know for sure that he's not a good teammate, but it is interesting to me that you only really hear about him being friends with Josh Hader. And I don't really hear too much about him being buddies with a bunch of guys on the team. I think a lot of people respected him because he was a good pitcher and he did. And Corbin Burns competed. Like, I don't want to make it, he was a competitive dude who was able to throw 200 innings for like 3 years in a row, which Brewer pitchers, that's rare. Like, he was healthy, he was competitive. Corbin Burns was a very, very good pitcher for the Brewers. And I do want to make sure that's clear. Like, but I had a hard time rooting for him for a while now. And to me, it was always just this self, like, dude, he looks at himself in the mirror and thinks, wow, that guy is awesome. Like, that's to me how I viewed Corbin Burns. And I don't mind not having that anymore. And I think there's an element of
Mhm.
just having better like team first people on the team um, that can help going forward as well. But yeah, I try not to
What's
rant too much.
funny, yeah, what's funny about that point though is too is in some ways that type of player is like needed. I think of obviously we're gonna talk about him a little bit later, like a little bit later, but like my favorite player of all time, Ryan Braun, like I think he had that aspect to him as well, but he also like you heard about how good of a teammate he was.
Yep.
Like he took a lot of people under his wing. Like I think about 2018, like he some of it might be for show and whatnot because he was the older guy in the team, but like he really stepped up and like was making it known that he's a leader and he would talk to a lot of the young guys and stuff. So again, a lot of that stuff was like PR and whatnot or whatever the nonsense is, but like he didn't have to do that. And you also are a type of guy where you're successful because every successful player feels like they're the guy. Like that's probably a common thread with them.
Yeah.
Like you can ask Freddie probably thinks he's the dude. Um, and he probably needs to get a little bit more of it so he can be a little more consistent, but like a great guy. So I think it's just like I said, a fine line of, and we can talk about some of the interview comments, I guess, is kind of where I wanted to go with this next. And some of it, again, it's more that fine line, like, okay, whatever, I'm reading too much into it. Like, I think his first comment was like, oh, I was on the couch with my wife, and then I saw the Brewers GM call me, and then I was like, oh, let me guess, I got traded, which, whatever, everyone thinks like that. That's not that big of a deal. But then he's just like, yeah, they gave me the whole spiel of like how much he meant and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, we can we just say that we appreciated you? Like I think it was meaningful what we said. And you mentioned like this is reading way too much into it. I can't talk about like his like friends and stuff, but he literally did mention like you brought up that point, but he literally said like because they're gonna play the Orioles, I think like April 10th to 12th or something like that. And he said, yeah, I'll say hi to a couple of those guys. Like I
Yep.
guess yeah, that's true. But like and he kind of joked about like Pat and stuff, like how he would like throw one in the dugout or something at him because whatever that like that stuff's nice. But he did kind of literally say that he'll talk to someone like a couple of the guys. Um, I think the one comment though too that you brought up, and this is kind of the other one that I highlighted that I don't think I'm reading too much into. He said that it was kind of nice being a part of like the most successful Brewers run of like all time in their franchise history. And he said that one comment he did say though, it's like it felt nice to always be feel like we were one piece away. So you're basically saying that we weren't good enough every single year, but we were just we were one piece away. If we would have got this, we didn't trade Hater, we should have got an extra bat. That's basically what you're saying, which is like I don't know. I don't think you need to get into that part of the team. You had enough to win. For the guy who actually didn't perform in the playoffs too, if you would have did your job, we could have actually advanced. So, um, I don't know. Now I'm getting emotional, but
Well, I do
um,
think, like, you think back to the Hater trade. What was the thing going on the whole time? The clubhouse is not dealing with this well. Well, if
mhm.
Corbin Burns, the guy who's in the middle of just coming off a Cy Young season, is a guy who's complaining about it a lot and saying, like, well, we thought we had pieces, but now we don't. Like, that's gonna permeate through the clubhouse. It's gonna cause problems. And again, we can't. absolutely guarantee at all that this is a legitimate problem that he was causing. But to me, it always felt like when these things came out, that Corbin was often at the front of it. And I mean, you touched on the Braun thing, and we'll talk again. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes here, but let's think about how similar the Braun situation is. So obviously, Braun's PED thing happens later, but what did the Brewers do that whole time? They stood by Braun. They stood up for, I mean, they said, he made a mistake. We don't we don't agree with what he did, but never at any point did they rip on him or do anything. And what did Braun do to repay it was constantly talk highly of the organization and constantly try and do whatever he could to help the organization over the years. Christian Yelich comes in. He knows Yelich is taking his role, and he knows it pretty quickly. Like he's about to be the next guy on this team. And we were at the game, Gunner, the back-to-back homers to win it. And the first thing Ryan Braun says is, Christian's such a good hitter. The fans here in Milwaukee are going to love him. And like he said that in front of the whole crowd. It was on TV, it was everywhere. Instead of being like focused on himself in that moment, it was immediately to Christian and how the fans in Milwaukee are going to love him. It always felt like he just had a much different connection, and I get it. And not everybody does feel as connected to the city and the fans. And I'm sure he appreciated how fans stood by him through the PED thing. But other than people on other than people on Twitter who were asking some dumb people in 2019 wanted to just give up on Burns. For the most part, the fan base stood by him pretty well while he was struggling because they knew of the potential too. So it always did feel like, and they don't need to, everybody doesn't need to be thanking everyone and doing all, I get it, but it always felt like, man, he should at least have some level of being grateful to the organization and to the fans and how everybody did stand by him through struggles. And then, like you said, he does have a win in the only Brewers win since 2018 in the playoffs. So that game he pitched well in, but he struggled in a lot of his playoff appearances. In 2018, Jeffers got a lot of the hate for the game two loss, but Burns is the one who originally blew the game or blew the lead. It goes back for a while, and he has the right to be full of himself in a way, like you said. But it always felt like Braun channeled that into a positive energy, and Burns kind of channeled it into everybody hates me, and I'm the guy, and I need to be the guy, and it just always felt a little different when he would talk about it the same way that Braun did. Like Braun was a cocky dude. There's no doubt about it at all. But it always did feel like like you kind of said, it channeled it back into a team type of belief instead of like yeah, I'm doing really well, but I don't know, the team might not be good enough. Who knows? I feel like if we would just add somebody, then we'd probably like he never made comments like that. Nobody does. Only Corbin Burns does. So that's why I know a lot of people liked Burns, and this trade hurt a lot of people in terms of just losing one of their favorite players. And I will say, watching him pitch at his peak was unbelievable. Like he was incredible. But the last couple of years of Corbin Burns, I frankly haven't enjoyed him being on the team or watching him pitch nearly as much as I probably should. But those are the reasons why, and that's why for me, this was not. I didn't hurt at all when I saw. I was excited when I saw the news, and the return obviously helps that. But even just somehow getting rid of maybe the best pitcher in Brewers history, starting pitcher, felt like a good thing to me, and it's a weird feeling, but that's where I ended up landing on the whole thing. So I think I've probably done ranting about him, but Gunnar, you got
Yeah.
anything else?
No, that was a good way to end it. I'll leave it on that. I'll just thank him because he was, like you said, he was probably the best Brewers starting pitcher technically on paper, so in history. So you got to thank him for the last 6 years. We talk about his playoff performances all you want. He got us to the playoffs as well. So he did mean a lot to us, and I guess that can end our Corbin Burns and all the trade talks and everything like that for that section. But we'll move on to we mentioned him, Ryan Braun. I won't now I could rant on this for a while, but I will literally try to keep it as short as possible. Um, Ryan Braun was inducted to the Brewers Hall of Fame, which I think will be like this summer or something. I'm not sure on the date on that, but I'm going to raise the question to you, Spencer, because everyone knows my answer to this. But we know this because this actually happened too with Jim Gantner. This a little bit of a you can't use my number, but it's not retired. So should the
Yeah.
Brewers just retire number 8 for Ryan Braun?
Yes, they should. They should. He's not the best Brewer of all time, but he's behind Robin. He's got a pretty good case. Um, they absolutely should. And I get that the precedent that they've set is basically you have to make the Hall of Fame, and that's not going to happen for Braun. But I think in terms of like you look at the era of Brewers baseball, like he defined that era of Brewers baseball, and he won an MVP and he made a bunch of All-Star games. Like pretty hard not to. He played his entire career with the Brewers. Like he didn't play for anyone else. We won't even give Reese Hoskins a guy's number, like you said, Jim Cantner, who had an OPS starting with a 6. We wouldn't give him his number because he played his whole career for the Brewers too. Just make it official with Braun. I mean, they've handed out 8 since then already, I believe. Um, but I think they should absolutely. I thought they did.
I don't think they did because I feel like I would have blown up about that, but maybe.
You might be right, but either way, like I think they should officially retire bronze. And
Yeah.
while we're on the subject, either retire Gantner's or start giving it to people because one, he doesn't deserve to have it retired, and two, if you're going to do this stupid thing where they can't do it, then they might as well have his name up there so that people know they can't get it and why nobody wears number 17. Like
Yeah.
I don't care about numbers very much in general, but to me, it's just a really stupid thing they're doing with this, and I don't like the Gantner thing. But yeah, Gunnar, I know your answer to that, but what are you thinking on the retirement?
Yeah, obviously I would. And I won't speak too much on him, but I just looked it up because people will probably have like, oh, you can't put a cheater up there. Uh, Barry Bonds, I think, got his number retired by the Giants too, and he's not obviously in the Hall of Fame, and that's he's in a whole other league of his own. Obviously, he's one of the greatest players of all time. That's not what Ryan Braun is. Um, by career status, I think he is, but no, I mean he deserves it, and it's just I think how I kind of view it too is kind of like telling the story of the Brewers. I think it's kind of impossible to not. He has his own era, really. I mean, from 2008 or 2007, but 2008 that was a huge year. And then he kind of like you said, passed the torch off to Yelich. I mean, that was a whole decade plus of him being in the Brewers lineup every single day, being our face of the franchise. So. I just think having number 8 up there is kind of part of our story, and it kind of just has to be up there, especially because he also just deserves it because he was good and all that. So yeah, I mean, Spencer, you can kind of slide into this next part here of the Brewers ranking of by Baseball America.
Yeah. So I will say Ryan Braun was in the lineup every day except for like, 65 games or so in 2013. But
Yeah,
um
and his thumb injuries,
and his thumb injuries in his back, yes.
which he played through
He did.
sometimes.
He did. We know how. But no. So just to quickly wrap it up here. So I touched on it. Baseball America now ranks the Brewers as the number 2 system in baseball. Like I said, DL Hall is ineligible on most sites, but eligible on that one. He checks in at 93 on their top 100. MLB Pipeline came out with their top 100. Jackson Churio at number 2, Mizorowski at 33, Caro at 35, 46 for Tyler Black, and then Joey Ortiz checks in at 63. So another top 100 there. So kind of based on like what we touched on earlier, that does mean that Pipeline views Ortiz as the number 5 prospect in the org. They haven't done their updated team lists. I don't think they do them until March usually. So sometime during spring training they'll come out. But that does mean that Ortiz is viewed as the number 5 prospect in the system by them. So I mean, 4 guys in the top 50. It's the first time the Brewers have ever had that on Pipeline's list, which has started about 20 years ago, I think they said. So definitely, I mean, we've talked about it so much, but the level of talent right now is pretty impressive. And like I mentioned earlier, the ability to amass all this talent without ever finishing worse than second in the NL Central during the last 6 years, 7 years, is it's pretty impressive. So I mean, just adding more talent to the system, Hall probably would have checked in, I would guess, in the 90s as well if he was eligible for this list. So could have been up to 6 on the top 100. But yeah, that's pretty much it on the prospects. So Gunnar, why don't we throw it over and finish it off with our random Brewers? What do you got?
So I've got pretty good underrated brewer here. I remember him when I was I had to be like 6 or 7. I know he had a couple stints with the Brewers when I was younger, and a guy who I thought he probably should have played a little bit more than he did. I think he just didn't have a position, and that's Russell Branyan. I was trying to look up. I think either I another one of those scenarios where either I gave him the nickname Russell the Muscle, or I've heard him say that maybe
That's
like
what it is. That
Brian
was his.
Schroeder. Um, but reason why I always called him that, or maybe I heard it from The Rock or something on TV when I was a kid, but he would just hit monster home runs. Had just so much power, and like I said, I don't think he had really a position because you would think he would have got more of a crack to play because he always hit wherever he went for the most part. So, had some really good pinch hit home runs and stuff for memories. I think he was on that 2008 Brewers team. Pretty sure he was.
Yep,
He didn't play a
yep.
ton. Maybe he had injuries or something
He
like that
was
too.
basically just pinch hitting at that point,
Yeah,
but he hit 12 bombs that year.
yeah, he had really super good memories. So, um, people who know me have now listened to me in this podcast for a while. You would know that this is my type of player that I like watching. Is a guy who just hits monster home runs. So, um, yeah, Spencer, who do you got?
Yeah, first of all, on Branyan, I believe he still technically holds the longest homer in AmFam Field history at the moment.
Yeah, Ricky
Um,
Sexton might be up there too, I bet. But
yeah, well, I think it's based on like when they started really tracking it, which was '08, which was his year here. Um, it's just a little surprising when you think about it, considering Prince was here for that
yeah,
long and plenty of big home run hitters, which leads me right into my random brewer, and that is Chris Carter. So I sent I sent Gunner this, I guess it was probably a couple weeks ago now, but I had seen this floating around on Twitter. That 2016 season that Chris Carter spent with the Brewers. So obviously people remember the 41 home runs. It was an 820 OPS, so it was a solid year all around offensively. If you go look at his Baseball Savant page, the amount of pure red on that page just blew my mind. And the one that really blew my mind was the fielding. He was worth 5 outs above average that year, which put him in the 88th percentile. I That was a big dude. Like, and I will say he was 45th percentile for sprint speed, which at 6'4", 245, that's absurd. He could move. Now whip rate and strikeout rate were not good. We're talking first and third percentile. His expected batting average was like 22nd. But I'm just going to go through the rest of these quick and just point out how insane that season he had and how legitimate it was, too. It wasn't like he was just hitting cheap home runs and getting lucky. Um, his expected batting average or his expected weighted on base average was 368, 90th percentile. Expected slugging was 536, 93rd percentile. Average exit velocity 91.7, 93rd percentile. Barrel rate was 17.6, the best in baseball that year. His hard hit percentage was 46.2, which was 93rd percentile. Sweet spot percentage was 36.3, 82nd percentile. He only chased at a 24.7% rate, which was actually in the 75th percentile. He just swung and missed a lot, but he actually wasn't swinging at bad pitches that often. And then he walked at a 12% rate, which was 89th percentile. So, and then along with the fielding, his whole his whole thing just looks red, and it's insane that he got one more little cup of coffee with the Yankees the next year. At, I mean, at that time, how old was he? He's
yeah, he'd be like 30 years old. He wasn't that old. That was like prime years for most people.
right. I think he's only. I'm not even sure if he's 37 right now.
Did he have like a Korean career maybe after that? Like you can't just waste
He
all that good
he,
hitting.
he turned 37 in December. Like
Wow.
he was done after 2017. He was 30 when he left
Yeah.
baseball. I believe he is. I saw something on Twitter that he was playing in Mexico and just dominating or something like that. Um, but yeah, I mean that one season of Carter was really, really fun. And obviously 41 homers stands out. And I know a lot of people did not enjoy the strikeouts that year, but it wasn't just power. Like he was a legitimate hitter that year. It was taking walks. I mean, not a super high batting average, but it was more than homers. It was doubles too. It was
Hmm.
just, and apparently some of the best infield or first base defense you could find. So, um, I just, I couldn't believe that. I thought I had to talk about that one, and I enjoyed Chris Carter, but I think I probably would have appreciated that season even more now because he, it was legit, and it's shocking that a 29-year-old put up that season, had one kind of season for the Yankees the next year, and then didn't play in MLB the rest of his career. Like that's insane without like a horrible injury or anything.
Yeah.
Um, and at a time where people were starting to accept strikeouts as part of the game, he was, I mean, it was bad. It was a 32% strikeout rate, but if you hit 41 homers and an 820 OPS, then you can let that slide with good defense at first. Like it's crazy. But no,
Yeah.
that's my guy. Gunnar, I
I
know you
did
probably
I did
like
look up. Yeah, I mean, for Chris Carter, I can't even explain that to be honest. I did like him watching them, but part of it too, I mean, one, it's baseball, so who cares what your record is? Like you're just hitting a ball. It's not like we're
right,
I think in the NBA sometimes if someone had like inflated stats, it's just like, oh, they're on a bad team.
right.
Maybe they had that type of thinking, but that would be stupid thinking because it doesn't really matter that much. But yeah, I can't explain really his career because it was weird. Um, I did look up Russell Brannon's home run, and it was 2004. He had the longest home run in Miller Park history at 480 feet. So I'm actually shocked. Like you said, Prince, I'm shocked Prince didn't get into one more than that. I know Yelich had like a 500-foot-ish one in Colorado, which is completely different, but
Yeah,
um, yeah, older
yeah,
than you thought.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, yeah, he just Russell the Muscle was definitely his nickname across the board. People were calling him that at every stop.
Oh, and I
Um,
definitely said Brian Schroeder. I shouldn't disrespect him. I think it was Bill Schroeder. I should have said. I combined both of the
and you
guys'
called him
names.
The Rock, which is the wrestler slash actor. He's just Rock,
He is the Rock.
just Rock.
The Rock. Yes, he is the
No, he's
Rock.
not. He's just
No one
Rock.
else is Rock. He is the Rock.
Um, yeah, but I mean, both of those guys were probably underappreciated in the moment because people did not like strikeouts at all at that time.
Mm.
Um, Brandon had a lot of really good seasons overall. Even I think he hit 30 some homers the year after he was with the Brewers in '08. Um, so yeah, he unfortunately it turns out he's probably not a very good person, but we
Hmm.
won't touch on that very much. I just need to throw that out there so nobody hates us for talking about him highly. He's not a good person, but our memories of him as a baseball player are more fun than what he ended up doing not that long ago. So, yeah, I think that kind of wraps it up. This is going to be another long one. We keep saying that. I guess this is just how long we go now, Gunner. Um,
Yeah.
but for those of you who did make it all this way and are listening still, we really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're on. Remember to follow us on Twitter at the Cream City Pod. Again, we have that giveaway going on. It's our pinned tweet, so check that out. And then, as always, please feel free to leave us feedback on how we can get better. And if you ever have questions or anything, throw them out there and we will do our best to work them into an episode as best we can. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
See ya.